Hey, good morning. Hey, we're gonna continue our study, and so today we're gonna talk about some pretty tough questions. So should women submit to men? Should women submit to church leaders, church pastors? And the typical idea is often that when there's a woman in the church and she happens to be a widow, or if she's single, or always was single, that she needs to submit under male leadership in the church, especially the pastor or the elders, and so on. And I'm just going to start off with sharing like the traditional things that we grew up with in the Mennonite community, especially in the more extreme Mennonite out of Mexico, I guess, and then a lot of it probably wasn't as much done over here, but over there it was pretty crazy. But I'll start off with a verse in 1 Corinthians chapter 11. You're probably all wondering, when is he going to talk about that one? When are we going to mention that one? And it's 1 Corinthians 11:3. It says, but I want you to know that the head of every man is Christ, the head of woman is man, and the head of Christ is God. So this is a verse that has caused a lot of wow. It caused a lot of wow. Like, I don't even have words for it. But anyway, this verse we're actually going to cover in the next video I want to talk about. But today I want to talk about the submitting, because this verse is talking about the headship. But this is where a lot of weird stuff has come from, especially from the way I grew up and the way things are done right now. And it's just read in a lens that is just not healthy at all. It's read through a lens that's just full of garbage and literally full of dung or crap. Lived in Mexico for many years and grew up in a Mennonite tradition, and maybe many of you came from that. And so the way we lived there, if the women definitely did not have any rights, could never speak up in church, could never do anything. Actually, women and men sat separately in church, and women had very little rights when it came to stuff. They just basically were made to work in the kitchen, take care of the food and take care of the kids, and the husband did whatever. And a lot of abuse came from there, a lot of things that were covered up that would never really came out, but now have come out in the recent years, or stories that I've heard how women were treated and how they felt, and how they felt so insecure. And it's still today, whereas in that culture, when they grow up and they get old and the husband ends up being the one that dies first, and the woman literally doesn't know what to do, is so insecure and just can't even do anything for themselves, because they just grew up that somebody always had to lead me and always had to did everything for me. Didn't have to, but did everything and controlled everything. And so, yeah, it's pretty bad how it was. And but today I want to talk about verses in Ephesians chapter 5, and you're probably wondering, when is he going to talk about that one, eh? Ephesians chapter 5 is a lot of good stuff in there, a lot of good stuff. And when you probably hear the word submit, I don't know, maybe you're the kind of person that you started to cringe and you're like, I did not want to hear that word. Maybe we should just cut that word out of the Bible because it just seems like a bad word. And it gives the idea for a lot of people, and they literally actually promote the idea that, submit is almost like, okay, well, you submit. If I do something wrong, you still need to submit. Just like if you're wrestling and you have them in a headlock and they just need to give in, tap out and say, okay, whatever you do, I will do. I don't like what you're doing, but whatever you do is okay. I'll just let it be, because that's what I'm called to do. I'm called to just submit and accept the bad that's going on. I want to start off with verse 1. This chapter I would say, is actually not about marriage. The focus has always been about how a woman ought to submit to the man, and it starts in verse 20 or verse 21. He says, submitting to one another in the fear of God. All right. And then in verse 22, he says, wives, submit to your own husbands as to the Lord. For the husband is head of the wife, as also Christ is head of the church. He is the Savior of the body. So there's this comparison that as God is up here, the man is down here, therefore the wife is down here. So there's levels. Okay, God, we see him as God. He's way up here. So therefore man is obviously lower than God. And then so it says, it gives it that order. So woman obviously is lower than man because man has to be over women. And I tell you, that is a messed up idea of how you view God. That's how you will view people in your relationship and how you will react in between people. And sadly, this is happening in the church where the leaders think that God speaks to them first because they're appointed leaders. They're up here, they're inferior in the way. They won't say it. They might even say, no, that's not what I think, but the actions surely show it. Trust me, ask your congregation. I bet you a lot of the congregation does not dare to speak up or speak to you in the same way as they speak to their friends. That's why pastors often feel like they're alone. Because the congregation, maybe not intentionally that you're trying to do it, but it's the idea, the teaching, the way things are done, the programs, it always brings the idea that he has authority, God speaks to him directly, therefore I dare not speak because he's an authority. So, this is equally between women and men under the authority and the leadership in the church often, because I'll tell you why. One time, because I've always been in some sort of involvement in church for many years, did stuff, youth leader, song leading, different things that I wasn't really gifted in, but I did it because I'm just like doing stuff. Anyway, so literally the one time, I spoke to this one man, we hung up with him at somebody's house and we were just having a good time. And you know what? The man's response was, he was amazed that I had taken the time to talk to him. He was like, he felt honored that he could talk to me and that I was willing to talk to him and to see him as him and to have a conversation. I'm like, why? Like, just because he saw me up here and himself down here, but I never intended it that way. I didn't think I was that way, but it was the way the things were done and the way I talked, just because I shared things doesn't mean that I was up here. Just because I spoke up about things or did stuff, was in any sort of leadership, didn't mean that, it's almost like they thought automatically they had to be underneath. They had to do whatever they say because God obviously called him to be in leadership and I can't challenge that. I dare not speak up against it. Or dare not even consider myself to be at his level and can't talk to the same. And I felt that way too for many years. To a pastor, you couldn't talk the same way as you could to your good friend, because you had to. You felt like you had to be careful because you never know. You might say something wrong. You can't really reveal yourself. You can't be yourself around church leadership because it's some holy presence that's there because the leadership is there. And that's sad. And I know pastors don't try to do that, and they might not do it. But some actually do feed on that. They love it, and they actually will make sure people know it, that God is here because I am here, and therefore you ought to listen to whatever I say. And I think in large, the communities we come from, they don't intentionally do it, but it does bring that message across because of the message, the way things are done. And it's the theology, the idea, and especially in the marriage, especially when you start preaching this, that the woman ought to submit to the man because he is in this, you automatically will see that the people will translate the same thing to the rest of the things. And it's because it's a wrong mentality of you and God and how you see yourself under. Okay, so now, let's get to it. I want to talk about starting in verse 1 in Ephesians 5. It's so amazing. It says, therefore be imitators of God as dear children and walk in love as Christ also has loved us and given himself for us, an offering as sacrifice to God for a sweet smelling aroma. All right. Now, I want to read it to you in a different translation so you can kind of get yourself out of that rut, because a lot of people, we read this certain translation and they have a certain idea of it. It was told a certain way, and it's just like, yeah, but really totally missing it. Okay, let's read in a different. It says, be imitators of God in everything you do, for then you will represent your Father as his beloved sons and daughters, and continue to walk surrendered to the extravagant love of Christ. For he surrendered his life as a sacrifice for his love, for us, for his great love for us was pleasing to God, like an aroma of adoration, a sweet healing fragrance. All right. He surrendered himself to the people. And in this, what was pleasing to God? That Christ loved us. God is not pleased by how much you love him. God is actually pleased by how much Christ loved us. It was pleasing. It was like a sweet smelling aroma. It was a sweet smelling sacrifice to him to love us, not us loving him. Us loving him and just sacrificing our lives for him is not the sweet smelling aroma. It's receiving and living in the idea that how much he has loved us. Okay, and so we really need to understand, what does this word submit mean? What does it actually, what does it look like? What is the context of this whole thing that when Paul reads in Ephesians 5 how, the wife ought to submit to the husband as unto the Lord, right? Because it's pleasing to the Lord. Like if it's, if he's lording over you. I think it was Augustine that quoted saying that wives ought to serve their husbands as he is, like if he's a Lord. Doesn't mean he is a Lord, but you should treat him like he is your Lord. Yeah, you better treat him like he is your Lord. But isn't that what it is? Like the context of this whole chapter is not actually that he's focusing on the marriage. It's not, he's focusing not like that you should do this and this and this ought to be, but the focus is always, Paul always would remind you, remember how much you are loved, and live in this revelation that you are loved, because that is what is pleasing to God, that you are loved, like that he so loved you. And okay, so I'm going to read in a different translation in Ephesians 5:21. It says, out of your reverence for Christ, be supportive of each other in love. In other words, submit, supportive, or serving, or attach yourself. And it says, for wives, this means being devoted to your husbands, like you are tenderly devoted to our God, Lord. For the husband provides leadership for the wife, just as Christ provides leadership for his church, as the Savior and reviver of the body. All right? Now, like it says, be supportive of your husband because he's your leader and you got to do whatever he says. Like the thing is, if you just take that and start teaching that and are demanding that, then you've lost it. You've missed the whole point. You've missed the whole idea of what love is. You've missed the whole idea of what marriage is. When you start teaching that, okay, let's say a woman comes to you and says, I'm being abused by my husband. He's abusing me physically, mentally, or gives me no right. I'm just ought to do whatever I ought to do. Then you come and she seeks help in a way because she's not happy. She's just not happy, and she's tired and feels suppressed and feels silenced in so many ways. She comes for help. And then the answer, I would say 90% of the time, the answer is you need to support him because he's your leader. Trust him because God put him there, and you better lead him, because if you step out of this umbrella, out of this order, things are going to fall apart. Chaos is going to happen. The devil's going to get you or whatever because you're not protected under his leadership. That is just a messed up, seriously, that is totally ignoring the person of the woman, and that is giving the idea that the man is superior. Now, I want to give you an image. If you see, it's because they use the image. The idea is often that Christ is up here. Okay, he came to love us, right? Everybody agrees that he came to the earth to love us, but you always still see him like this. Man was over here, all right? He loved us and then the idea is that he loved us from up here. No, he didn't love us from up here. He did love us from heaven, but when he came down to show himself, to actually show what his love really meant, he came down here. Man was over here. He stepped himself lower than man. Like he submitted. He submitted himself to man. He esteemed humankind higher than himself. When he would teach the people, he didn't have the idea that I know everything. I'm superior being than you, so you better listen to me. This is what thus saith the Lord, you shall do this, and look down on the people. No, he submitted himself. Look at how he served them at the Last Supper. He washed their feet. And the disciples couldn't believe it, because the disciples, they thought, this guy, if he is the Messiah, like he claims to be the Messiah, then, we need to serve him. We need to wash it. Peter had the idea, and he says, no, I want to wash your feet. And Jesus is like, if you don't let me wash your feet, then you don't get it. You don't get what love really is. You don't get the love of God if you don't let him wash your feet. He served the people. He says, I did not come to be served, but I came to serve. I came to submit myself to mankind unto death. He submitted to the man, to mankind until they even killed him. He submitted himself. That's how he says. So Christ came down and saw mankind like this and served him and loved him that way. Okay, so if you want to use the example of Christ being here, like if you want to use an order, then do it like this. See the wife over here, and you yourself as a man serve her like this. But it isn't. You're like this. You're equal in the same way, and you serve one another. You submit to, because right before it says submit one to another as unto the Lord. And then the second verse 22, actually the word submit is not even in there in the Greek. They just decided to put it in there. And it says in the King James, it says, wives, submit to your own husbands as to the Lord. Actually, the word submit is not in there. It literally says wives and husbands submit as to the Lord. Wives and husbands, like basically just says wives and husbands to the Lord. Submit to one another, wives and husbands to the Lord. All right? Because it just doesn't make sense the way it's written. The topic isn't the wife and husband. The topic is one to another. And he uses the example of a marriage, how they serve one another, how they are together in the Lord, and how God is the source of them together. And so I hope I made it clear enough to understand like what the whole point of this is. Like the point isn't that you need to keep an order, and that we need to teach the woman to submit, or else it might disrupt the order of things. The point is love. And if you start demanding submission to one another, so if the husband starts saying, wife, you need to submit to me, then you've missed it. Then you've totally missed it. If you start demanding it, then there's no opportunity to give. Okay? In the same way, if the wife demands love from the husband, then you've missed the opportunity for him to give it. Because love is given some like service and support, and the word submit is actually a word like supporting, serving, or even attach yourself. He says, wife, attach yourself to the husband. That brings me to the next passage I want to talk about is in Colossians chapter 3. Colossians chapter 3, he talks about how in verse 12 he says, you are always and dearly loved by God. And in other words, in another translation it says, dearly beloved, holy by God. Like he says, you are holy. And it says, so robe yourself with virtues of God, since you have been divinely chosen to be holy. It says you are holy. You've been divinely chosen to be holy. You are one with God. You have the love of God in you. Because if you say Jesus Christ came into your heart, you're saying the love of God moved in with me, and it is within me. And he says, so therefore live like you are. In the beginning he talks about you have been resurrected the same as Christ has been resurrected. The same resurrection lives in you. And so he says, so live like it. So live like if you're like, you need to know what you are before you can live who you are. All right? And then all the way down to verse 18, and it says, let every wife be supportive and tenderly devoted to her husband, for this is a beautiful illustration of devotion to Christ. It says, let every husband be filled with cherishing love for his wife and never be insensitive toward her. All right. So often people get so caught up in the wording and how it says, and then there's the ones, they're like, I will not submit to anything. I'm not going to get myself to a ball and chain to any person. I am a free person. I'm going to do whatever I want. Yeah, you want to be closed up like that. I know when loving someone, that you expose yourself and you're vulnerable, because there's opportunity for someone not to love you back or to hurt you, even though you're loving them. Because when you love them, you give yourself to the person, all right? And then this is often ramped and pushed on the woman. You need to give yourself in every way. When he requires something from you in bed at night, you better give it, because if you don't give it, that doesn't mean you love him. And then to say that I don't want it, they say that it's selfish. They're teaching the woman it's selfish not to give you. So the idea that you have to tell people that that like you're demanding things of them. That is not love. You're not teaching them love. The whole idea, you totally missed it. It's a whole legalism. The whole idea that demanding love is legalism, and then the whole idea that I'm equal, therefore I will do what, like, their strife and fight to equality is not the goal. The goal is love. So when you start seeing how Christ served the church, and there's a passage actually that talks about how this whole thing, and it says, and he came to serve the church. He gave the church everything. I think it's in 1 Corinthians chapter 3. And he says, you have everything. I've given you everything. All authority has been given to Christ, but then Christ is like, now I give it to you. I've moved in with you. I am one with you. I am with you. And so Christ came to serve us and not to be served, but he didn't need service. He came to serve us. And that's, if you want to use that example and how to treat your wife, that changes the idea of how and how things are done. And then so if you have the idea that submitting, the wife needs to submit and then husband ought to love, that you think that it's some sort of order that it needs to be done, like, and if you change the order of things, it's going to destroy everything. It's going to disrupt and destroy this whole society and how we ought to live. Moralism is just going to go out the window and people are going to do whatever they want. You know what? There's a study, there's a row of doctors I can name, maybe I'll post it, but there's a row of doctors that did a study. The difference, they were having issues in the church marriages. There was a lot of divorces happening in the church, and they were wondering what is going on, why is it? So there was no agenda. Why did they decide? They wanted to solve the marriage problems, and they were wondering why the marriages, obviously divorces happen because they're unhappy. Man, it's getting loud in the rain. Hope you can still hear me. But anyway, so the marriages obviously get divorced and fall apart because there's just misery in there and there's unhappiness. Okay, well, they found out the whole patriarchy, or the complementarian idea, which is just a pretty dress put on hierarchy and patriarchal idea of marriage, where the man is superior, woman is down here. And anyway, so they found that only 20% of those marriages were happy, that were working out. And you know what? If your marriage works fine, the way if you as a wife love it that he leads and he makes the decisions, and you love him and you want to support him and you want to give it to him whenever he wants it, and then it works for you, and I believe there's genuine love between people like that, and that's how they but they're like, okay, our marriage works good and it's pretty and it works amazing. So, and they see somebody else's marriage is falling apart, and they're like, okay, the issue is she's not submitting. She's not being like this wife that's so humbly submitting to this husband. That's why it's working. No, that's not why it's working. It's working because you love one another and you're willing to do that, and it works for you. Okay, fine. But that does not mean that is the formula how to have a good marriage. Because one day, at some point, there will be issues that will arise, and that whole hierarchy thing just crumbles and falls apart. Or they keep doing it, but they're miserable for the rest of their life. All right, that's why you wonder, at some point, that love, that something gets disrupted, something happens, and that's why there's marriages that are in their 50s, have been married for 30 years, and this whole thing, at that 50 years, all of a sudden they're like, okay, I'm done. I've been unhappy for 10 years. I'm out of it. All right. So then they found out that egalitarian marriages, where they saw each other equal opportunity, equal leadership, this is how they saw each other. It wasn't that they were consciously always trying to make sure they're equal, but it's just that's how they saw each other, and that's how they dealt with things, and that's how they worked together. Then those marriages, over 80% of those marriages were happy and working together and staying together. Divorce rates were like way lower in that. Like, so that's why it's the point is love. But when you want to use the formula of standard like this, and you think that's what holds a marriage together, no. They might at some point, but they're miserable. Like, are you happy in that way? Anyway, so the whole point is that when there's love, there's submitting to one another, there's serving one another. I forgot her name, but she mentioned that So the question was, well, at some point somebody has to take the lead. At some point somebody has to lead. So, okay, let's say you come to disagreement, and then you have an equal argument, but you have to make a decision. So who has to take the lead? Who has to take the lead? Right? People always have to. Why the reason that the fact that they're asking that question is already missed the point. But okay, let's say you come to that point. Let's use that example. You come to the point you made to make that decision, right? And the woman said they would always there's always a different circumstance, but in circumstance work it out. They would submit to one another, right? There was no question. They're submitting, the husband supporting the wife in a decision, the wife supporting the husband in a decision. They would work it out that way. But it was never done where they would throw the trump card on the table and say, I'm a male, therefore my decision trumps yours right now. Even though our argument is equal, decisions are equal, our rights are equal, but the male throws this card down, my card trumps yours, therefore the decision falls on that side. And I tell you, that's even in the complementarian relationships, it's always that idea, that mentality is that the man's ideas are superior to the woman's, and therefore the opinion of women is a lesser opinion. So when somebody says that, you're automatically saying you're loving them from up here down, and that is not love. God came down here and loved us and supported us and served us. And so that's how the husband ought to serve the wife. And then the whole submitting makes sense. It just looks, then it's a beautiful thing. You're doing it to one another. She supports him. He loves her. It just gives his life for her. And then it's just all, but in order for you to demand this order and demand that this is how it ought to be, then you've missed it. And you think that the reason your marriage is falling apart because she's not here and he's not up here, because sometimes there's marriages that are like this and it's working, and she might even want to do the leading in many areas, but the church is like, that's not right, and he feels guilty because he's not stepping up here. He doesn't want to be up here, but the church is trying to get him to get up here and take the lead and do the leadership, and she's like, actually, I would love to do that. Why can't I do this? So he supports her in what she wants to do or is called to do because he loves her and was willing to give his life for her. And that's how that Christ did the church. He's like, when he went up to heaven, he says, I've given you all authority over the earth to go and preach the gospel. He submitted himself, and he says, I will send you a helper. I will send you the Holy Spirit. And now it's you. I support you. Now you go into the world. Christ supports us. He submitted himself to us to serve us and to have that. That's why we're called co-heirs with Christ. We are brothers and sisters. He says, that's why he said to the disciples, I don't call you servants, I call you friends. He considered himself equal with the disciples. Wow. And you might think, who do you think you are? I am the son of the living God. And you are the daughter of the living God. And we don't submit to men as hierarchy or control idea. But yeah, so that's how it is. And then, so yeah, a lot of marriages, if it's your fight to equality, you can wreck your marriage on the way, or your relationship, or and anything on the way that too, because the point isn't that. But the idea very often is that the reason how to fix a marriage, how to fix a relationship, how to fix your life, how to fix a kid's life is to make sure they're like this. I'm up here, you're down here, and you better understand it and you better know it. And I'm telling you, I read a story the other day of this woman. They were on their honeymoon. All right? You wouldn't believe it how often this happens. It was the first night. What happens on the first night of the honeymoon. All right. So anyway, she was tired. She didn't want to. And he was like getting onto her, and she was trying to lovingly kind of say, not right now. He eventually lost it, pushed himself on her, and raped her. And that is often done right in the beginning just to show that I'm in control. I need this, and you better give it every time. And it was demanded. I'm telling you, husbands, once you demand something from your wife and you think, and you always are thinking in your mind, if my wife only did this, if she needs to do this, you've missed the point. You've missed it. We've missed it if we start doing that. And church, it's the same way. If the church says, if only my congregation would do this, you ought to do this, you ought to know that I'm an authority, and you do this, you've missed it. The leaders of the church are there to serve the people in the church, to serve the congregation, to support them in their calling that God has for them. They're actually out to kind of like to encourage them in their gifts and to encourage them in their calling that God has. God has a calling on someone else. If you have to go, you have to go it. Like, we're cheering you on. That's what leadership, cheering on someone that's got a call, and that's how it ought to be in the marriage and how in any man and woman relationship. You're cheering on each other. And a lot of people are like, oh, that doesn't work. Two leaders, just, one has to. It's just you're missing the point. You need to get the idea out of your head. Once there's one love one another, then there's no, you should get rid of the consciousness idea that who's going to be the leader and who's higher than the other. You work together and you work it out because you love one another and you serve one another and you support one another. All right. So, yeah. And that if the wife, husband, I have some homework for you. I dare you, or any man out there who thinks they need to be an authority or or think they're inferior to a woman, I dare you to go and listen to a woman. Anything, especially in the spiritual things. A lot of times in the workplace, they're willing to listen to women, and a lot of men surprised me, and they said they love how effective and how good women are in their workplace. But I dare you, in the church, get a woman to share something, ask her what she's learned, or listen, and actually hear and take it as wow, I learned something from her. Her revelation is of value to me. It has helped me. It has supported me. I have learned something from them. I want to encourage you with couple more verses in Ephesians 5, and this is where he concludes it. This is how he concludes it. He says, this is the point. He says, for this reason, a man is to leave his father and his mother, lovingly hold to his wife, since the two have become joined as one flesh. One, not one. Because as soon as there is one up here, one this, that does not mean you're one. All right? Marriage is the beautiful design of the Almighty, a great mystery of Christ and his church. This is a mystery. He said the mystery is that Christ and his church. You know what? Because the mysterious thing was that this Jesus, made himself one with the church. That was the difference. This was the mystery that the Jewish people could not get to their head, that God would become one with the people, and that he would stoop down and just bring them up to himself. And so that's how he says, so every married man should be gracious to his wife just as he is gracious to himself. How you serve yourself, that's how Christ takes care of his body. And there's another passage where it says, if how he ought to serve and his wife is just like he takes care of his own body, like Christ takes care of his own. And then it says that Christ serves the church. He uses the same example, how you take care of your own body. When your body needs something, you take care of it. When you're hungry, you eat. When your body's hurting, you fix it. That's how you ought to serve. Like, you love your body. And so Christ serves the body, which is the body of the church, right? So he says, and we're all members one of another, right? And then he says, and every wife should be tenderly devoted to her husband, right? And it's the way it's read. It's just, this is how it should be. Well, he's describing marriage and church, how Christ loved the church and how they are just joining. They're like, when you use the word submit, how he attached one another. Christ attached himself to the church. He left where he was and came and attached himself to the church to become one with the church. That's how the husband comes to the wife and says, I'm attaching myself to you. We are becoming one. Let's go live life together. And that's where changes everything and what the word really means and what it actually looks like. So, hope it helps you out. Bless you, and we'll see you next time.